We're all good at something.
Now that doesn't mean we're always good at the same things. Successfully managing diverse classrooms means learning about our students. Let's create an imaginary classroom full of diverse students. We have grasshoppers and ants. They're both good at different things. Grasshoppers can jump high and ants can carry up to 20 times their own weight. You can't really ask ants to jump like grasshoppers. In a regular class, if we teach jumping to 5 grasshoppers and 5 ants, the grasshoppers will be really bored and the ants will be too challenged. Differentiated instruction is all about maintaining an equilibrium. If you have a differentiated classroom, that means your ants and your grasshoppers are held to different standards. So how do we differentiate instruction? Well, we might group our students.
Differentiated instruction was a new concept for me, and when I learned about it, I wondered if teachers actually used it or even knew about it. I asked 5 teachers. Only 1 out of 5 knew what differentiated instruction was. However, when I told the other teachers what it was, they said they already used it unknowingly and that it tended to be a natural part of the classroom. Here are some of the interviews.
I use differentiated instruction in my classes for two reasons. One, I studied under Carol Tomlinson while I was in school, so she would probably kill me if I didn't use it. She's one of the pioneers of differentiated instruction. And two, I use it, I think, just innately. It does come natural to me, I think, to put students into groups. And then when you think about grouping them together, you think about, well, what can they handle? Is this group of students strong readers? Is this group of students strong speakers? And I do want to group them together by the type of skills that they have, the strengths in reading, for example, or strengths in writing and strengths in speaking, listening.
Yes, I do believe I do use it. I think maybe all teachers do to some extent.
Okay, and why do you use it?
Well, I use it so that every student in my classroom learns. Every student, whether they're at the higher level and need to be more challenged or at the lower level need more assistance. I don't know if it's an obstacle, but you do need to do maybe a bit more planning than you otherwise would, and you also have to be sensitive to the students who are at a lower level so they don't sort of feel like they're different than the other students.
No, it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's so important to the Board of Ed is that you follow through on the curriculum, that you complete each lesson, and you carry everything to completion. And because supposedly at the end of the term, your students are now ready to take a standardized exam, and that's not always the case. You know, theoretically, things seem like they're doable, but in the practice, it's very difficult.
I think some teachers may find it difficult in theory to accept because you don't know how to differentiate. Maybe if you don't know your students yet, you think, well, I have to spend a lot of time doing assessments before I can place them into groups based on what their skill levels are, or what their interests are. I think maybe it would be difficult to implement it in the beginning of a course, or if you were just teaching a workshop and you
Okay.
don't know the people that you're working with, then it would be really hard to say, okay, well, we're going to now have all of the people who are interested in, who are more let's say, who are more like tactile learners in this group and others who are more visual learners in this group. You can't do that if you don't know your students. So I would say the best way to deal with that situation is to group them into as many small groups as possible so that you can give them one-on-one attention in the small groups, because you don't know at that point.
The first step is pre-assessment. For some students, the class will be too easy. For others, it'll be too difficult. The key is getting it just right. When we assess students, we assess their readiness, their interest, and their learning style. Readiness has to do with your students' prior knowledge. Have your students ever heard of this before? Have they heard of it but aren't sure how it works? Have they learned about this and know how to use it? Can they demonstrate their skills? Interest has to do with your students' likes and dislikes. To find out what your students like, you can hand out a survey. Ask your students what they like learning about, what their favorite classes at school are and why, what their least favorite classes are and why, and what they like to do when they have free time. Learning style is the way your students learn best. Some students are physical kinesthetic learners and they like to move around and they like to touch things while they learn. Some students are visual learners and they like to see pictures and images while they learn. Other students are auditory learners and they're great listeners. The way you can assess your students for their learning style is by handing out a survey and asking your students what they like to do. Do they like writing? Do they like reading? Do they like drawing? Do they like to watch sports? Do they like to play sports? Do they like dancing? Do they like playing musical instruments? Do they like singing? Do they like listening to music? Do they like playing outside? Do they like working on their own, or do they like working with others? Once you know what your students know, what your students like, and how your students learn best, it's time to differentiate. This is where creativity comes in. The idea is to use your students' readiness profile, their interests, and their learning style to create different paths to the same curriculum. Teachers can differentiate content, process, and product according to their students' readiness, interest, and learning profile. Content is the curriculum. It takes into account your curriculum goals and objectives and the IEP goals and objectives of individual students. Here's an example of the many different paths approach. Content is in the middle, and all of these different items on the outside surrounding content are the many different paths that teachers can use to help students access the curriculum. Teachers can assign students to small or large groups based on auditory, visual, or physical kinesthetic learning activities. Teachers can also incorporate peer mentoring and pair higher level students with lower level students, and further modify the curriculum to students' skill levels, like in our ants and grasshoppers example, where ants were expected to jump 2 centimeters and grasshoppers 20 feet. It's also important to make necessary accommodations for students with learning disabilities. For example, students with visual impairments might need to sit closer to the blackboard and may need materials with larger font type. Product refers to learning outcomes. Students are assessed for their mastery of the curriculum. In differentiated instruction, this is specific to how students demonstrate their knowledge and how each student applies their knowledge. Grading reflects individual student progress based on the model of differentiation. Learning contracts can be useful tools for both teachers and students. They help students commit to their assignments, stay on task, and they also help students become actively involved in their learning process. Differentiated instruction is characterized by ongoing assessment. At the end of each learning cycle, students' skills are assessed and students are regrouped based on their performance. We can see our ants have advanced at a much higher rate than our grasshoppers. We've isolated 2 groups of ants. One group has outperformed the other. We started off with 2 groups, and now we have 3. Maybe we can use peer mentoring and pair some ants with grasshoppers. The learning cycle is a continuous process of assessment, teacher planning, and implementation.
These 2 resources came up following my conversation with Ocean. The first is a book by Carol Tomlinson. This book has been circulating around the office, and all the teachers I interviewed are reading it for more information about differentiated instruction. It's very helpful and gives various examples helpful for implementation. The second is a new startup website that many English teachers might find helpful. It has current events articles with a corresponding selection for levels of difficulty on the side of each article.